Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to the lecture on storytelling for the directing class COM 373. And I was asked to implement this this lecture by our head of undergraduate studies because they wanted to make sure that we were focusing on story and the human component of this art form, right? So we have all these machines in front of us, we have the cameras in our hands. It can be alienating, but ultimately this class is about that human aspect of it and telling stories in a way that remind us of ourselves, our humanity, our struggles, our achievements, these things that are really compelling when we watch the cinema. And remember, this class again is about narrative cinema. It's not documentary. So be creative. I often think that you could do this writing in the form of dialogue. So you may just go right into your notebook and instead of writing out a story in sentences, start writing your characters actually speaking to each other. And again, if it's an informal writing session and you don't have the pressure of it being permanent, that can often be very creative. So handwriting in a notebook is fine. Typing on your phone is great. Anything that kind of takes the pressure off you to have a finished product today is really, I think is really helpful. So as we go through this lecture today, as I mentioned before I started recording, we will stop and I will ask you to do a 10-minute writing session and then I'll start the recording back up again. And hopefully in those small writing sessions, you come up with something really valuable that you as a storyteller, you as an author, you as a filmmaker see value in. All right, so normally, if we were in the classroom space, I would have a discussion now about stories that you find compelling. It's a little alienating in this environment, so I think I'm going to skip that and I'll hold the discussion session after the lecture is done. And I'll ask you maybe if you want to share things with the Zoom class before we go into the group work. So let's think about storytelling. First of all, as a sort of academic exercise. And when we're thinking about source material for our stories, there's so many places that we could go to. For example, I think many good film producers will go through old newspapers and they'll dig through these old newspapers and they'll try to find stories that are compelling, that are human, that have a great structure, but maybe have gotten forgotten about or lost. And those producers will then seek out the person whose life was told in that article and try to buy the permission to make a movie from that story. That's a legitimate path to making a feature film that shows up on Netflix or on the movie screens or Disney Plus or wherever it is that we're now watching movies. So if you're trying to make a feature film and you want to have rights for it, that's a great way to get source material and then to get the rights. You do have to have the okay though to tell somebody else's story. So your source may be just the inside of your head, right? Maybe you're Charlie Kaufman and everything is coming from your creative imagination. And then you don't have to worry about rights or chain of title. If everything is from inside of your head, you own it as soon as it goes on a piece of paper. That's changed. In the old days, you didn't own it until you put the copyright logo on it. And so Night of the Living Dead, one of the greatest films ever made, George Romero lost the copyright to that film immediately because he forgot to copyright it. And so for decades, that film was used for free, was misused, was put on television over and over again. And George Romero didn't get paid anything for that. He was more careful with all the follow-up films, which were big hits, Dawn of the Dead, all of those things that George Romero followed with. And he eventually got the copyright back when the copyright laws were changed, so that now everything you write is copyrighted the moment you write it down. You may not be able to prove it, but the idea is the same, that by putting it on a piece of paper, you own it. Now, you know, proving that you own it is a different story that I'm not going to deal with today. But I've just talked about two sources. One, you go to a newspaper, you find an article. Another source, you pull it straight from your head. A third source is to adapt a piece of literature or adapt a book. So if you can go to the author of that book, think of The Shawshank Redemption. I spent the last year working on a screenplay adaptation of a story about an Arab farmer that saved Jewish families during the Holocaust, but in North Africa, not in Europe. But that came straight out of a nonfiction book that told the story. And the author of that book asked me to help him with the adaptation. So pretty straightforward, the rights on that. The author himself gave me permission to write the script, and now together we're trying to sell it. So hopefully that becomes a script sale. So that's another opportunity for you guys to think about how you might make a movie. Is there a book out there that you want to adapt? Is there something, some website that you think is really interesting or clever, or an Instagram influencer that you think really has a unique life that you want to make a film about? All those different things are sources that you may go to. Maybe that's what your creative writing is about today, is what are some of these sources that you think might make a really good film. Okay, so the next thing I have on this PowerPoint slide is the idea of amplification, where we take a story that is compelling in one medium, but maybe it's not quite cinematic, right? Maybe it's a great short story, but it all takes place in one room and there's not a lot of characters. And so in this medium, we amplify it by adding other characters, by adding a B story, by adding extra conflict. And so that's why you'll see so many times a film that says, instead of saying, this is true, this is based on the truth, because very often you have to amplify the story in order to make it cinematic. We're looking for human connection. So these things that go back to the universal. Everybody struggles with different things. So you build a film that deals with that sort of human struggle. People will connect to it in hopefully in that way that you intend. Think about so many films that are about a difficulty that a human being is having. Death of the Salesman pops into my head, and how we as an audience place ourselves into the narrative structure and connect to that story. So is there something from your life that you know of or that you've heard of that you think people would automatically insert themselves into the narrative in some interesting way? Is there some way that the human beings in your audience can connect to your story in some way? And then finally, the last thing I want you to consider is narrative structure, right? And so every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every good film has a moment of reversal at the end. And I talk about this a lot more in screenwriting, but I'll just say it's a moment at the end of the story where there's a shock or a surprise or a change. And think about, Oedipus that you guys all read in high school, Oedipus Rex. He finds out that he killed his father and was sleeping with his mother, and he stabs himself in the eyes with forks. That's the shocking ending to that narrative structure that we now expect as an audience. So a couple things on what an audience expects in the narrative filmmaking. They expect dramatic stakes. They expect a character to say, this is what I want. They may not say it in exactly that language, but we know pretty early on in almost every movie what the main character is after. They want to be a better person. They want to make more money. They want to make the football team. They want to date this person. All these things are part of the narrative structure that's almost a grammatical rule in filmmaking. So something you guys should think about is that narrative construct where we have a dramatic need. We see if the need is met or not, and that's drama, right? And then we have a surprise reversal at the end, and maybe the character finds out I didn't really want what I think I wanted, or the character gets the girl, or the character gets carried off the shoulders on the arms of the other football players. Who knows? So those are some of the points to consider. I hope that while I was talking, you read this PowerPoint slide. And I'm going to move on. I won't, in any of my lectures, read slides to you. I find that to be terribly boring, but I will talk about the things on the slides. Okay, so another thing to consider is narrative rationality, meaning does the story make sense and does it show fidelity to life? Does it seem to be true? Do people actually experience life in this way? So is it coherent? Does it show fidelity to life? Maybe too early for you to be thinking about exactly that at this point, because really today is about creative writing and thinking about whatever you want to think about. But as you're structuring this work into a more coherent narrative, these are the things that you're talking about. Does the story make sense? Think about how the film Inception, such a great movie, I think, how they had to stack thoughts and stack rules into that universe so that ultimately we watch it as an audience and say, okay, yeah, that makes sense within the rules of Inception. It doesn't make sense within the rules of the real world, but inside this narrative, those rules are clear, they're explained, we get it, and the film adheres to those rules. And so that's what a rational narrative does, is it creates a sense of space, and then it adheres to that, the rules of that space. Another great example of that is Being John Malkovich, right? Which creates this crazy space, but because it does it so coherently, everything else that happens in that space that follows those rules makes perfect sense narratively. Okay, so I'm going to stop the lecture now, and I would like you to think about free writing for a second. You can either write about what I just spoke about, stories you know, people you know, things you've seen, or you can take one of these items that I have here as a suggestion. Give a family heirloom that means something, like a mirror that your great-grandmother owned, or is there a particular place that's very meaningful? The old asylum, the old insane asylum that used to be on Route 28 in Rockville that burned down in 2003. You guys are probably super young. Or is there a family story, a family relation that you want to tell? Okay, so I'm going to time you guys for 10 minutes. So please bring out your notebooks. I'm going to stop the lecture, stop the recording for 10 minutes, and I'll be back in 10. This handout is one that I would normally give in the classroom, and I've got them in the file cabinet at USG. And so what I would ask you to do is now about your free writing. I want to give you these categories just in your notes and ask you to write down some ideas around them. So the first category that I have here is the title of your movie. So in your notebook, please go ahead and give your film a title. And it's not one that you have to stay with. It's one, you know, it could be a working title. You might keep it, you might change it. The next thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to write out 2 character names, one for your lead character and one name for their main opposition. Who are these 2 people that are creating a conflict in your film? So once you've written out those 2 names, let's have you go to the conflict itself. What is that conflict? What is it that they are competing for, fighting over? What's the source of drama in your movie? Okay, next I want to ask you, what is the resolution of that conflict? Who wins, who loses? Is it a happy ending, a sad ending? Is somebody killed? Is the crime solved? How is the story resolved in your plot? And then lastly, I would ask you to add to your writing notes some kind of surprise at the end of your film. Something that is going to cause the audience to rethink everything that's happened up until that point. So Aristotle refers to it as reversal and recognition. And in his thinking about dramatic theory, he refers to Oedipus, and it's not just Oedipus discovering that that he has killed his father and slept with his mother, but it's the realization also of the horror of that moment. So it's not just the change in circumstance, but it's also the character themselves realizing that change. Another great example is the film Rudy, not in Aristotle's writing, obviously, but Rudy, strives for something. I'm not going to give away the plot in that, but he strives for something in the whole film. And then in those final moments, we see the resolution. I'm not going to tell you how it resolves itself. I think you should watch the film, but we get to see that resolution through the eyes of the characters. So I think it's really important when you guys are plotting this, that you give us that scene at the end where the characters watch each other, watch the solution. That moment of celebration. Star Wars, the original Star Wars Episode 4 now, did a great job of this at the end, after the surprise, the recognition of that surprise. Okay, so I think this is enough improvisational writing. What I'd like to do is I'd like to open up the class to a discussion. And let me do this. Let me stop the recording and we'll go into discussion.